Okay, so yeah, just a quick background for WREN. WREN is part of the International Energy Agency's Wind Technology Collaboration Program. The IEA Wind was founded in 1977 to advance wind energy research, development, and deployment. There are currently 26 member countries participating across 16 tasks, and WREN is one of those tasks. It's designated as task number 34. And WREN stands for Working Together to Resolve Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. And it was initiated in October of 2012 as an international forum for supporting wind energy deployment through a better understanding of environmental issues, efficient monitoring programs, and effective mitigation strategies. We currently have 13 countries represented within WREN from North America and Europe. This is the 17th webinar that WREN has hosted since its inception. WREN has also produced 8 fact sheets and short science summaries on topics such as European wolves in wind energy development and bats in wind energy, and 4 white papers, 3 of which are in the peer review publications. And all of the information about WREN and these products can be found at the TETHIS website with the link presented here at the bottom of the slide. So with that, if you do have any information or questions about WREN, I should say, please feel free to contact me. My email is there on the screen. Happy to answer any questions you might have. And I'll stop there and hand it over to Roel, who will introduce the webinar and our speakers.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I will now quickly also present something here. Let's see, how do I get rid of the end there? Okay, welcome to the webinar on Raptor behavior and physiology as it relates to wind energy. We will now kind of talk through a number of talks, 6 talks in total, of ongoing research. But why this webinar? Well, first of all, we have one priority activity on raptors at the moment within WREN, to set focus on kind of ways we can kind of reduce uncertainty regarding risk for raptors at wind farms, but also trying to kind of collate and also communicate what could be kind of identify kind of effective tools for avoiding, minimizing, and reducing mortality, but also look further into kind of what options are there exactly also for compensatory mitigation. This webinar is especially related to the first bullet point, where we kind of first would like to kind of present kind of ongoing research, you know, what is the state of the knowledge at the moment on raptor behavior and physiology. And later on during the year, we will follow this up by an expert forum on ways to kind of, how can we kind of actually kind of model risk and what kind of different approaches are there and what are the pros and cons related to that. And then after that, kind of try and summarize this up in a science summary on the state of science regarding drivers of risk and how you could kind of address those. So that is a bit the background on why we have this webinar at the moment. But why raptors? Well, yeah, 2 papers, and as you can see, kind of when it comes to collision risks from a paper from Thaxter et al., the raptors kind of score highest on the collision rates per turbine per year. But also in a recent paper by myself, we also see that kind of they score very high as being one of the species groups that are highly affected by not only collision, but also disturbance and habitat loss. And that is because of different things, I think. It is because of their long-lived species with low reproductive output, so they are kind of, populations are quickly affected, but also their physiology, kind of they're adapted to flying and hunting for prey in the air and on the ground. And are really adapted to doing that. Now, therefore, also adept flyers, you know, with soaring and hovering behaviors and ways to move in the air. And then kind of having a turbine, so birds of prey being preyed upon by wind turbines, as it were. you could say that kind of, why is that happening? And it could be, you know, a number of things that kind of have been addressed in earlier research, like updraft attraction, which is also related to their wing morphology. You know, where they are, the habitat associations and requirements, mitigation or dispersal, they're kind of actually their sensory cues, visual fields, but also possibly kind of divided attention and social interactions, or even inexperience or naivety, that they are kind of spending a lot of time in the air, but maybe also not being kind of expecting an obstacle in their airspace. And last but not least, also weather conditions like wind, etc. So there's many different things that could affect them. But without going further into depth in that, I would like to kind of invite the speakers and introduce the speakers that we have gathered today for this webinar, that will now talk us through various aspects of both raptors' physiology, their behavior, and what that consequences that might have with regard to their impacts. So we have Jeffrey Lucas and Esteban Fernandez-Dricius from the Purdue University talking us through about the physiology parts. Elliot Kwon will then look at kind of
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your slides right now. Do you think you could try resetting the slides?
Yeah, I can stop sharing and start again. I hope they're visible now.
Yeah, and then go ahead and put that into presenter mode, please. That's great. Thank you.
Good. Well, sorry for that.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Other mode.
So working like this.
There you go.
Yeah. So we have different presenters gathered together. As I said, kind of Jeffrey and Esteban from Purdue University. We have Elliot Kwon from the NREL talking about kind of the aerospace in which birds move. Going towards France with Guillaume Perron, who's looking more at kind of the spatial aspects of that and how they move in kind of the landscape. And also followed by Ana Teresa Marquez, who will look more into that. And finally, Sergio, looking also kind of at, you know, kind of the sighting aspects of this, using kind of a number of different species to focus on that. So I said kind of how we have a certain agenda where these different speakers will talk us through the different aspects that are, I think, are very interesting, and also show kind of the breadth of all the research which is being done at the moment in various parts of the world. So we'll have these talks now back to back. So they will kind of continue talking throughout the webinar. And at the end, we will then have a common joint discussion and question and answer session. So please, if you have any questions you would like to take up, that we take up in a discussion, please give these in the chat so we can kind of collect those, and we can kind of, well, probably a subset of that to address those in the discussion. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Jeffrey Lucas to the stage, and please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me share screen. I can't, you need to unshare yours. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see your notes though. So if you go up to display settings and switch to presenter view. There you go.
That one there.
Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, so what I want to do today is to tell you about some of the data that we've collected on the auditory system of golden and bald eagles, and as you'll see with sort of an eye to wind turbines. Oh, sorry. So the data were collected by Benjamin Galler, Patrice Baumhart, and Nadja Lovko. So I need to tell you a little bit about how we actually collect these data. We use something called an auditory evoked potential. And the way to think about this is that, let's say that we have a sound. So this is a picture of a sound. It's called the spectrogram. So frequency is a function of time. Can you hear that? A little bit. So hopefully you can see that, this Quank call is composed of basically 4 different tones. So what this bird is singing is a chord. And what we can do with that chord is to put that in the ear of a bird. We have to knock it out. Nobody dies, but so we have to knock it out in order to collect these data. And the way that the auditory system of the bird works is that this sound is converted into a neural signal. Well, a neural signal is also an electrical signal. So in fact, what we can do is to measure the electrical potential generated by the processing of any sound. And that electrical signal is an auditory evoked potential. So this, in fact, is the evoked potential generated by the processing of this sound by this bird. And then with some signal processing, we can generate a spectrogram of the evoked potential. So this is essentially a picture of the neural representation of this bird, of this sound. And it's it's a spectacular technology. I was asked to just give a quick overview of another project. This is not ours, but it's one done in Minnesota that was funded by the same source that was funded by us, just to get some idea about some other information about hearing in eagles in the literature. So this is a paper by McGee et al. And what they used evoked potentials actually to look at something called an audiogram, which is an index of how sensitive the auditory system is at a variety of frequencies. So here lower is better. So a tone of about 2 kilohertz, for example, well, you only need a sound of about 20 decibels in order for, in this case, a red-tailed hawk to be able to process that sound. And so what they found was that bald eagles, so bald eagles in blue, were a little bit less sensitive to tones than red-tailed hawks in red here, but not by much. And the other thing that these authors showed was that both of these species were fairly good at processing sounds on the range of 1 to 3 kilohertz. In an abstract, they also said that the audiograms of golden eagles and bald eagles were quite similar. So those are the data in the literature. So let's see what we have. So again, I'm going to show you some of our data on the auditory system of these 2 eagles. The goal was to look at sensory physiology to help us at least offer some suggestions about candidate signals that might be used as deterrents at a turbine. Esteban's going to talk about the visual physiology, and then I'm going to talk about auditory physiology of these eagles. I need to start by thanking a lot some wildlife hospitals and Raptor rehab centers, without which we never could have done any of this stuff. And in particular, Liberty Wildlife at Phoenix, Arizona, and the Wildlife Center of Virginia at Waynesboro were just really terrific in helping us out. So here's our approach. We wanted to find stimuli, both sound and lights actually, that are easily processed by the eagle sensory systems with the processing relatively unaffected by noise, so that if it's raining or windy, the eagle would be able to detect those stimuli. And we're also thought that, more sort of dynamic stimuli would be more alerting than sort of non-dynamic stimuli. And by dynamic, I mean things like frequency changes or amplitude changes. Okay, so we tested a number of different sounds. I only have time to talk about 3 of them. So I'm going to talk about how our eagles responded to single tones. We actually ran a couple of chords, but I'm going to talk about one chord, and then I'm going to talk about sinusoidally frequency modulated tone. So this is just a tone where the frequency changes systematically over time. We're also quite interested in knowing how the processing of these sounds changed with a background noise. So we have 3 treatments. One we had a background noise of white. So white noise, which is equal intensity at all frequencies, and then pink noise. And hopefully you can hear these. And hopefully you can hear that this is a lower intensities. The frequency of this sound is lower than that of white noise. And then we also ran the stimuli without any noise. Okay, so here's the first set of data I'm going to show you. So what we can do is take a tone. This is a 2 kilohertz tone, put that in the ear of an eagle. That tone generates a neural signal, which is also electric, that generates an evoked potential. This, in fact, is the evoked potential generated by the processing of this sound. Some signal processing allows us to generate a spectrogram of that evoked potential, and you can see that the similarity between the neural representation of that sound and the sound itself is quite high. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you something called phase locking intensity, which is how well neurons in the brainstem follow the pressure waves of sound, right? So it's an index really of the ability of the auditory system to process sound of a given frequency. Again, these are tones. Okay, so this is just phase locking intensity as a function of the frequency of the tone. And what we found a couple of things with respect to tones. One is that the species were similar, which is quite consistent with the data I showed you that were published by McGee et al. Another thing that we found is if you take a look at the processing of these tones without noise, that's green here, there is a fairly strong response to a wide range of frequencies, which is interesting. But the other thing that you see, hopefully, quite significantly, is that it with noise, with either white noise in blue or pink noise in red, there's a very strong reduction in the capacity of these animals to detect these tones. Now with noise, actually the response is strongest at 2 and 3 kilohertz, which is again sort of consistent with the McGee data. But again, the most important thing here is this difference between no noise and the noise profiles. And so the suggestion actually is that tones are a pretty bad choice to use to alert eagles at wind turbines. All right, so here's a chord that we used. So I'm going to call this a missing 600 hertz or 0.6 kilohertz. Those are the same numbers, fundamental. So what we did was we took a chord of 4 different tones, 1.2, 1.8, 2.4, and 3.0 kilohertz. Hopefully you can hear that. All right, so that's a chord of 4 different tones. Now, hopefully you can realize fairly easily that all of those tones are multiples of 0.6 kilohertz. But there is no 0.6 kilohertz tone in this chord. But it turns out that the physics of sound is such that if we put these 4 tones together as a chord, what that does is to generate actually a very loud amplitude modulation at 0.6 kilohertz. And there's a neural response both to this amplitude modulation and also to each one of these separate tones. Okay, and we can measure how strongly the auditory system responds to any one of those 5 signals. Again, the amplitude modulation down here and these 4 different tones. And so here are the data. So this is this phase locking intensity, how strongly it responds to the 4 different tones and that amplitude modulation. And what we found in some respects is that the species were similar in the sense that there is almost no noise effect. So you can play these things in white noise or pink noise or no noise, and you get almost exactly the same response, which is terrific, actually. The species are not similar in the sense that they differed in the response to the different tones here versus here, and you can see that they're different. But probably more importantly, the bald eagle's response is much stronger to amplitude modulation than is the golden eagle response. So these birds do not respond similarly to a chord. And the last thing that I want to talk about is sinusoidal frequency modulation. So this is where the frequency just changes systematically over time. That's what it sounds like. We have two rates, 70 and 110 hertz. And again, what I'm going to do now is to show you the frequency of the phase locking. So how closely does the auditory system follow that frequency change over time? And the data that I'm going to show you is the sort of average of a single cycle of that tone. So here's the tone. This is the evoked potential generated by the processing of that tone. And here's the spectrogram of that evoked potential. And you can see that the auditory system of this bird, this bald eagle, follows that tone quite well indeed. All right, so here are the data for bald eagles. We have two rates, 70 and 110 hertz. The black is the frequency of the stimulus itself. So that's what goes in the ear of the bird. And then as before, we have green, no noise, blue, white noise, and red, pink noise. And so you can see how closely the auditory system follows the stimulus. And what we found with bald eagles is that the auditory system matches the frequency of the stimulus spectacularly well. This is one of the best species at following rapid sounds that we've ever measured. Their auditory system is incredible. Not surprisingly, it's slightly worse at 110 hertz, but even at 110 hertz, there are very few species that can do what they did. And there's little noise effect. So if you have these dynamic sounds, the processing of those sounds really tends to be unaffected by noise, which is terrific. Here, in sharp contrast, is the data for the golden eagles. And what we find with the golden eagles is that they are truly awful at following even the slowest frequency modulation stimulus. So we have very little sort of noise effect, but the golden eagle auditory system, in a sense, is slow, and it's vastly slower than the auditory system of the bald eagles. Well, we ran a few behavioral tests. We didn't have a lot of time to do this, but we did run a few behavioral tests of both golden and bald eagles to different dynamic stimuli, amplitude modulation, frequency sweep, and then a chord. And what we did was to measure the head movement rates, which really is an alerting behavior. And what we found was that the level of alert behavior was higher in the golden eagles than in the bald eagles. There are reasons that we expect this to be the case, which I can talk about later. But there was no significant difference in the response to the different stimuli. So the bottom line here is that these dynamic stimuli are indeed alerting, and they're equally alerting across different kinds of stimuli, which again is actually terrific. All right, so here's the bottom line. That the notion that you have a hearing of an eagle is absolutely wrong. Eagles species differ dramatically when processing at least dynamic sounds, not tones, but dynamic sounds. Both species process pure tones well, but the pure tones are really subject to strong noise masking, which is a really bad thing. Moving sounds, on the other hand, either amplitude modulation or frequency modulation, are much less impacted by noise and therefore are likely to be much better alerting sounds at turbines. But there's a caveat, and the caveat is that we have a fairly poor response by golden eagles to fast-moving sound. So really, we have a trade-off between noise effects. So the noise effects are less for fast-moving sounds, but the problem is that the golden eagle is poor at processing really sort of quickly dynamic sounds. So our take is that the best kinds of sounds that we can use at turbines would be relatively slow-moving sounds that can be processed by both of these species. All right, so let me thank Avangrid Renewables and DOE Wind Energy Technologies Office for funding. And in particular, I want to send a shout out to Amy Parsons at Avangrid, who was just absolutely wonderful throughout this entire process. Okay, that's what I have.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And we'll continue right away with Esteban Renales. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see how I can share my screen. Just a second. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. This was a project that Jeff and I were co-PIs. He focused on the auditory component. I'm going to focus on the visual worlds of these two eagles. Feel free to reach out to me if you have visual related questions via email, Twitter. That's my website too. Sometimes it's difficult to discuss all the visual components that we measured in such a short period of time. Okay, so we need to start from this place, which is to understand that birds see their world in a fundamentally different way from the way humans see the world, right? And there are a lot of differences. Here are just listed some of them. So many bird species have their eyes more laterally placed than we do, and consequently, they not only have strong binocular input, but also strong lateral inputs on the right and the left. Humans have 3 types of visual pigments. Birds have 4 types of visual pigments. The translation is that birds can see more colors than we do, and they can see colors that we cannot even imagine. Also, in the photoreceptors of birds, there is an organelle called oil droplet that filters the information before it reaches the visual pigment. And oil droplets are thought to allow birds to tell 2 colors apart much better than we do. And also birds have photoreceptors specialized on chromatic signals, on color vision, but they also have photoreceptors specialized, the double cones, specialized on achromatic vision or motion perception. So given these differences between humans and birds, we decided to study the visual system of bald eagles and golden eagles to understand how they would perceive wind turbines, and also put that information out there for the development of eagle deterrent technology, with the ultimate goal of trying to reduce collisions with wind turbines. As part of that technology development, we explore a little bit the possibility of implementing some LED lights on the wind turbines from a more theoretical point of view, like what are the best colors that would alert these eagles. So here's a list of different components of the visual system that I'm going to be talking about today. We measure a few more, but we don't have time. But most importantly, we try to address these 3 questions using physiology information and also using a lot of visual modeling. So the first question is, how far away can eagles see wind turbines? How much eagles can see around their heads when they're flying close to the wind turbines, which leads to issues of attention. And if people are interested in putting these LED lights, what kind of colors would stand out more to the eagle eyes? So visual acuity is the ability of an animal to see detail over distance. So here's an example of using the visual acuity of chickens, how far away a given chicken would see another member of the same species, right, at different distances. And as you can see, over distance, the information degrades. Visual acuity is a function of the eye size of the species and the density of cells, and is expressed usually as cycles per degree. So here are the reported acuities that we estimated, and these are probably underestimations of bald eagles and golden eagles. They're relatively close to each other, but with these visual acuities, we were able to do some visual modeling relative to how far away can bald eagles, in this case, resolve the blades of a wind turbine. And the important thing that you need to remember in this slide is that we're talking about perfect light conditions, right? So here is here's a potential rotor of a wind turbine, right? And these are some of the distances over which the body would be able to perceive that. And you can see that even at 1 kilometer away, there is a degradation of information, but it's not so much. And it's not until you think of 5 kilometers away or even 10 kilometers away in which that information gets pretty degraded. And it might be very difficult for the eagle to resolve the blades of a wind turbine. The results for the golden eagles are pretty similar, so I'm just showing you these. But the bottom line here is that an eagle flying around a wind turbine should not have any limitation when it comes to visual acuity to resolve those blades. Now, I'll keep coming back to this. This is under perfect light conditions. So if you ask, well, under regular light conditions, will this change? The answer is yes, in a pretty significant manner. So the other thing that we measure is the configuration of the visual field. In other words, how far away can the eagle see around its head, and also the location and projection of the centers of acute vision. And as you might know, eagles have centers of acute vision called foveas in pretty much the same way as humans have foveas. So what we found in the bald eagle is that they have 2 foveas in each eye. So overall, they have 4 foveas that project in this way. And this is showing you the eyes, the eagle converging its eyes. And this is a top view. You have right here in gray, the binocular field. In black, you have the blind area. And in white, you have the lateral fields. So if we were to display this information in a 3-dimensional view, here is the head of the eagle, then this is sort of the visual rendering of that. And you can see the 4 foveas or 4 centers of acute vision right there. This is the binocular field right here. And this is where the binocular field ends. And what you see here is the blind area of the blind area starting of the eagle. So this is another view when the eyes are diverged. So the animal can increase a little bit the size of its lateral fields. And we got similar results for bald eagles, a little bit wider binocular field, but not a big difference. One of the interesting things that we found is that the species differ quite a bit in the degree of eye movement. So bald eagles can move their eyes much more, and consequently, because they can move their eyes much more, they can change in a more flexible manner the configuration of its visual field. And we believe that might be important when it comes to the quick change in their attention by reorienting these foveas in different parts of their visual field. So bald eagles should have a greater ability to that than golden eagles. Now, one of the most important questions that we were trying to answer is, okay, based on this visual field configuration, when these eagles are flying around the turbines, is there any constraint in terms of perceiving the wind turbine? So I would like you to focus first on the graph on the left, right here. So this is the golden eagle having its beak parallel to the ground. So basically the animal is looking forward. And as we mentioned before, as the animal is looking forward, this animal should have no problem locating the blades or locating the position of the wind turbine. Now, if you look to the right, this is when the beak is perpendicular to the ground. So the animal is quote unquote looking to the ground. So then we have all this blind area in the direction of flight. So that could certainly compromise the ability of the animal to detect the blade and consequently increase the chances of potential collision. Same viewpoint, same graph, but from a different viewpoint, right? So this is a lateral viewpoint. So you can see that effect of the blind area when the animal is quote unquote looking down. We found very similar results for the golden eagle. So I'm going to go through these very fast, similar implications. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is our findings when it comes to color vision. Just to give you a brief introduction, color vision is a combination of different parts of the eye filtering light in different ways. So the lens is filtering light, the vitreous humor is also filtering the light. And when it comes to the retina, right, here's a picture of the different retinal layers. In the photoreceptor layer, there is also a lot of filtering, and that filtering happens at the level of the visual pigments and at the level of the oil droplets. So we had to measure every single of these components in order to put together the picture of the sensitivity of these species to color. So here is the sort of summary of all these. So these are the 4 single cones that are associated with color vision in the bald eagle. And what you have here is the double cone, which, as I told you before, is associated with achromatic vision and motion detection. So the bottom line here is that these eagles don't have a violet sensitive visual system, so they cannot see in the UV, and that applies to both the bald eagle and the golden eagle. So both species cannot see in the UV. And using these sort of sensitivity curves, we were able to explore a little bit of, well, if we were to use LED lights on these wind turbines, what are the colors that stimulate the retina of each species the most, right? So we use that visual modeling using all the physiological information that I mentioned to you before and a few other things that allow us to build an eagle visual system model. And then we used information on the reflectance of the lights, the different LED lights, and the reflectance and irradiance of the sky and the visual background and whatnot. And then we ran this perceptual modeling. We identified those wavelengths that would be good candidates, and then we put those wavelengths to the test in some of the behavioral tests that Jeff was talking about a few minutes ago. So let me show you some of these modeling tests. So here is here are different LED lights peaking at different wavelengths. And the ambient light conditions, or the background, is basically the sky. And what you have here in yellow is the golden eagle, and what you have in black is the bald eagle. So you can see that they are similar to some degree, but there are also differences, a few differences between species. But the bottom line is that lights around the blue and lights around the orange red would be potentially good candidates. And when we change the background, we basically got a slightly similar result with this difference when it comes to the golden eagle. So we ran some behavioral tests at wildlife rehabilitation centers in which we had a stimulus, we had a camera. These were logistically difficult tests to run. And we can talk about some of the results. So you should consider these results that we're showing you as preliminary rather than final results. So here we have the head movement rate that Jeff mentioned to you before, and this is combining both species together. We also found differences between the species, but the trends were pretty similar. So this is the blue LED light flashing, the blue LED light steady, the red light flashing, the red light steady. So as you can see, there seems to be, and all these LED lights, by the way, are supposed to stimulate the retina the most. But from a behavioral point of view, the blue light flashing caused the greater effect when it comes to getting the attention of the eagles. So what are the take-homes? When flying close to wind turbines, is very important to do whatever we can to have the eagle's attention, right? Because that could decrease the chances of the eagle missing on a blade moving. LED lights have the potential to elicit that attention grabbing effect, and sounds, as Jeff explained, also too. If you're thinking about lights and eagles, please do not, I repeat, do not use ultraviolet lights. Bald eagles and golden eagles cannot see them, so don't waste your money on that. Now, a blue LED lights flashing based on all the modeling and the preliminary behavioral results seem to be very interesting candidates to test in the field. But the information that we got on the visual system actually can have other, besides developing LED lights for wind turbines, can have other applications that could save a little bit of money in terms of wind farm operation. So again, here's a picture of these wind turbines, and this is a picture taken with sort of the human point of view. But we do know that birds have a very different perception. And by the way, this is not reflective of any real bird. It's more of an artistic rendering to show you how different this could be. So we could think of a live tracking system that is following the ambient light conditions and air quality, because those two things, the combination of particulate matter and changes in light intensity, could affect to a large degree the detection of the wind turbines relative to the environment in which they are. So that live tracking combined with the avian visual modeling can provide a warning system that the visual perception of the blade might fall below the eagle's detectability threshold. Now we have the tools to do that. And if it falls below that threshold, then operators can think about using LED light activation or some kind of curtailment strategy. So that's something to consider into the future. And with all that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Esteban, for your presentation. Next speaker will now be Elliot Kwon. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Raul. All right, well, is everyone seeing the presentation slide?
Yes, we can.
Great. So yeah, my name is Elliot Kwon. I'm from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US. And as the last two speakers talked about how eagles or raptors see or hear in the environments, this talk would be geared more towards what they feel in the atmosphere and how they use the atmospheric boundary layer to move. I'd like to acknowledge a number of contributors to this work, namely two postdocs at NREL, Rimpel Sandhu and Regis Daden, as well as some outside support from Chris Farmer at FUST and Todd Katzner at the USGS, the US Geological Survey. So the work I'm presenting today is part of a DOE project that leverages recent advances in both mesoscale and microscale modeling from a number of different projects. The focus is on high fidelity modeling and flow resolving or predictive type capabilities. So the first part of the effort in this project is to characterize the soaring habitat. And this involves exercising a mesoscale model. And the second part of the project is applying microscale flow modeling, and I'll get into these details in upcoming slides, to characterize the flow physics, and also to take those model outputs and apply machine learning to model actual behavior of golden eagles within the atmospheric boundary layer. And then the behavior that we're modeling would be informed by our understanding of the atmosphere and how that varies from region with different terrain and variability across seasons, as well as time of day. So a lot of different spatial and temporal scales. So on the mesoscale side, we've performed a 20-year hindcast with the goal of increasing the spatial and temporal resolution. And we can use this information to better understand raptor movements. And all this information will be disseminated as a GIS layer within the Wind Integration National Dataset Toolkit. And we expect this resource to be complementary to existing presence, risk, and behavior models. And it should be pretty easily picked up by the community. And moving on to microscale methods, we want to combine turbulence resolving flow models, and going back to actually capturing the flow physics, with available telemetry data. And the end goal is to develop a product that's an open source tool that can be used by the community to inform siting and pre-construction risk assessments. And the intention is that this tool could be integrated with existing design and optimization tools. So now I'd like to frame the atmospheric modeling problem at hand and give everyone a flavor of the state of the art in our modeling capabilities. So I guess as we go through these videos on the next slides, maybe imagine that you're an eagle moving through this space. So at the largest scales, we consider the landscape. This is the mesoscale. So what I'm showing here, or what I will show, is a multi-scale simulation that spans both the meso and microscale. And this is from a project that NREL is working with a number of other national labs on, and this was performed by the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So what I'm showing here is flow in the Pacific Northwestern region of the US over the Columbia River Gorge. This terrain feature here is actually Mount Hood. And what you're seeing here is an overlay of the horizontal wind speed. And the dark blue regions, the cooler colors are lower speeds, and you can see a large topographical wake behind the mountain, and the flow is coming from left to right, so coming from the Pacific. So you can see very large scale flow features that are induced by the local environment. So now if we zoom in on the Columbia River Gorge, which you can see part of under here, this is a simulation now performed at NREL. So now we're looking at a vertical slice, again, of horizontal velocity, and now we can see turbulent flow coming off of terrain here. And in particular here, we have unsteady flow separation. And this is representative of the microscale or the local scale from an ecological perspective. So this domain is also representative of turbulent flow through wind plants. So here is a wind farm with 48 wind turbines. Again, cooler colors are lower speeds. And we can see a turbulent low speed wake embedded in the background flow behind each wind turbine. And this video hopefully is playing at near real time. And something I'd like to call attention to is the different time scales here. So we have this low speed wake that's embedded in the flow. The blades are moving much faster. And the background flow also has these slow moving large flow structures. So you have slightly higher speed regions in the darker red patches, followed by or adjacent to lower speed regions in the closer to white colors. So it's a very complicated operating environment that we're actually capable of resolving the features of. So getting into the first part is the flow modeling, the first part of the talk, first half of the talk. So what we're doing here is applying mesoscale to microscale coupling techniques. And this is a current project within the DOE research portfolio in the Wind Energy Technology Office. What we're doing is applying large eddy simulation. So this is a capability that can resolve the largest scales of motion within the atmospheric boundary layer. And it's these largest scales, and large is relative here, but these largest scales are the turbulent motions that contain most of the energy in the atmospheric boundary layer. And this modeling technique is able to actually capture all of the dynamics that include orographic as well as thermal updrafts. And so the goal is to take mesoscale models, for example, from the wind toolkit, and use that to drive microscale simulations of the wind plant environment, and then take inputs from both and use those to drive our behavioral model, which will be the second part of this talk. So what we've done on the microscale modeling side, we've selected representative conditions from the wind toolkit as shown below in the four wind roses. So we can see variation in the expected wind conditions by season. I apologize, the captions are a little small, but it goes from spring, summer, fall to winter. So we know that the prevailing wind direction is from the west, but we can also see that there are some off conditions as well that could be observed quite frequently, especially in the spring and summer. So this work applies recent advances within this MMC project, as I mentioned, and that includes flow field data simulation techniques to downscale from the mesoscale to the microscale. So as an example, I'm showing here a simulated diurnal cycle. These are outputs from from a mesoscale model. So data that will be publicly available in the Wind Toolkit. This is a representative diurnal cycle. And it's representative in the sense that on this fourth lowest panel, we can see a very clear kind of parabolic heat flux time history at the ground. So what happens is when the sun rises, the ground heats up and it drives the production of turbulence as well as thermal updrafts. And you can see the responding temperature in the atmosphere as well. It's heating up. This is a day in late spring. So I guess depending on which part of the world you're in, this could be a warm day or a pretty cold day at about, I think, 15 degrees Celsius. And so the simulation starts off with a spin up period to get rid of transients at the microscale, and then we start following the variation in the wind speed, direction, and heat flux. And what I'll be showing is the results from noon to sunset. So first, these are slices of the resulting flow field at the microscale, which is a terrain resolving large eddy simulation. And these are horizontal slices at 3 different heights above ground level. And the mean wind direction, as shown from the previous plot, is from the southeast. So we can see that there's a strong relationship between the simulated terrain as well as the patterns that are seen in the flow field. But the important thing to note is that there are pretty significant differences in as far as height. So we see differences in the magnitude as well as the size and structure of the flow field, even in a mean sense. And we can see that this is clearly a 3D problem, which should inform some of our behavioral modeling efforts. So now this is from the same simulation, and I'm taking vertical slices through the simulation domain. So I'll be showing the evolution of an afternoon. So this should last about 12 hours. On the top panel will be normalized wind speed. So it's the local instantaneous wind speed normalized by the wind speed in this first panel on the top right, which is the hub height wind speed. And what you'll see here, in the bottom panel here is vertical velocity. So what you'll see is over the course of the afternoon or late morning through the afternoon and early evening, you'll see the growth of the atmospheric boundary layer coinciding with the increase in surface heat flux. You'll see the development of larger scale thermal structures. And what happens is, as we get close to sunset, and at sunset, we'll see the vertical updrafts due to thermal heating sharply drop off. And you can tell by these histories, time histories on the right, where sunset is, where the heating goes to 0, or even switches to cooling. So now we can see these large convective plumes in the late afternoon, and the sun goes down, and then very quickly afterwards, these structures decrease in size and magnitude. So this just gives you a flavor of what we can model and sort of what we would expect an eagle flying through this environment to experience. So then now moving on to the behavioral modeling aspect, we want to use the same mesoscale weather data from the wind toolkit as the previous simulation, but we want to come up with a way to model their behavior and predict their behavior without having to use supercomputers. So what we do is we take flow data and we combine that with available telemetry data to calibrate a structured probabilistic model. So the goal is to encode behavioral drivers, such as what we've noticed in these left bubbles, into a structured model. So what we've considered so far is migration pressures, largely driven by orographic updraft. We're in the process of incorporating thermal updrafts, and we're accounting for variable meteorological conditions right now. And this is built on a terrain conductance model based on a fluid flow analogy originally developed by Dave Brandis et al. So the idea here is to start with some reference wind speed, wind direction. We have a map of the local terrain, and from this map, we can estimate orographic updrafts. And from that, we can calculate a migration potential. And this, you can think of the gradient of this right panel as being what drives the eagle. So then we can now fly a large number of virtual eagles through a given site of interest. So for a given set of atmospheric conditions, we hear, in this case, this is northerly migration in the spring for a certain date and time. So we can see from flying 900 eagles through this domain, we can come up with this single presence map for these conditions. So we can then run a variety of atmospheric conditions, which would give us an overall presence map in summary. So part of the advancement from the original terrain conductance model is we've incorporated uncertainty. We allow the eagles to take missteps. So as it's flying through the domain, it has a probability of taking different directions that deviate from sort of the optimal migration potential. And it allows us to capture the uncertainty in how eagles might interact with the environment and wind plants in that environment. So this is largely complementary to field work. It's not going to eliminate field work, but this can help us supplement our data sets where we have limited field obs. So now to validate this model, this is an example of telemetry data on a particular day. And this is in the fall. So the eagle is flying from the north, in the northwest corner here, flying towards the southeast. So running this model simulating 500 eagles during this period of interest, we can come up with this likely migratory corridor that follows the local terrain that's slightly obscured here. But we can actually see that our model is able to very clearly predict the flight path trend here. And in addition, we're also able to see that there's some avoidance behavior you can see. So the eagle appears to want to go south, southeast, and then it kind of reaches these rows of turbines and kind of turns around and then goes around. So this can offer us some behavioral insights as well. So works in progress. We're continuing to evaluate and conclude our evaluation of this site of interest. We have a paper under submission at the moment. We want to extend this model to other sites and do additional validation with different locations and species. We're still trying to synthesize everything we've learned from our high fidelity models. For example, the updraft and the unsteady updraft fields. How do we characterize the statistics from that in terms of time and space? And also understanding the additional atmospheric drivers such as 3D effects. So if we look at flow over a transect, we would expect the vertical velocity in blue here to sort of match the change in elevation, which is our basic assumption. But we can actually see that due to the 3D nature of the terrain, there's sort of, there's not a perfect agreement. So better understanding this idea of the correlation between the local flow and the local terrain. And moving beyond our basic assumptions about those mean flow behaviors. And finally, including additional environmental drivers, for instance, prey sources and other like water sources and other environmental things that might affect eagle flight behavior. So that's all I got. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Elliot. Next speaker now will be Guillaume Perron. The floor is yours, Guillaume.
Hey. Yep. Do you get it?
Not seeing your screen yet, no.
Are you seeing it or?
Nope.
Okay. You were saying it a few minutes ago. Now?
It's coming, I think.
Okay.
Yes, so if you can put it in presenter mode, it's good.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to present works that dates back to 2017 when I was a postdoc at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. And now I'm at the French Center for National Research. And just as a side note, I'm going to have this accent for the whole talk. So some background about the work. We were dealing with the environmental issue of collisions of flying wildlife in wind turbines. And the thesis of the paper was that if we better understand the vertical distribution of the birds, we can help inform where to place new turbines or how to curtail the existing ones. And we focused on large soaring raptors, which is handy for this webinar, and but was mostly driven by the availability of data. So a short word about soaring flight. So soaring flight is the main flight mode of a large raptor, and because it will allow them to extract energy directly from the atmosphere and so fly cross country at very low energy expenditure on their own muscular work. And there are two sources for this. There is a thermal updrift, which is basically air bubbles that form above warm soil, and that the eagle the raptor can use to gain height. as demonstrated on this. Do you see the arrow? As demonstrated on the image. So there are the characteristic circle loop that they do while they stay in the bubble, and when they have reached the height that they want, they exit the bubble and they look for another one. And the alternative to that would be, well, one of the alternatives to that would be orographic uplift, which is basically when they like literally ride the wind, and as the air mass encounter mountain slopes, they will rise up in elevation, allowing the birds to basically hug the slope, as demonstrated at the start of the trajectory that's on the right. So at the start, he was using orographic uplift. Then he found a thermal convection cell, and then found another one. So this implies that they have the ability to find those convection cells. So in all the talks were about the perception world of the birds, and they have this ability that's apparently, I don't think nobody understands yet. And how do people document and model this soaring flight? Is by putting 3D GPS tracking units on the back of the birds. And my study used what's now called the older generation devices. So they are already solar powered, meaning that they can last for a long time. But they only record data every 15 minutes at best. And there are often gaps in the time series because when the sun is not strong enough, or when the GPS cannot transmit information. And the other issue, like technical issue that I dealt with in the study, was observation error. So for example, when we compare the recorded flight height from the GPS units and the ground elevation at the same location, we arrived at the conclusion that about 1/3 of the time they were flying on the ground. So that's a pretty strong clue that there were errors in those data. And the other feature that we had to deal with for like robust inference would be heavy tails, meaning an excess of a very large error. And they are large, but not always easy to detect on the raw data. So so to deal with that, the first step was what I devised was a continuous time movement model. So basically decompose the variance in the flight height into the error component and the biological component, using the fact that the different recorded locations are temporarily autocorrelated in the case of movement and are not in the case of error. And this was not not very welcomed by the community. I don't know exactly for what reason. And I tried to clarify the ideas, which are not that difficult, but whatever, in a recent paper. So I'm putting it here. And to do that, in practice, I use template model. I just put that slide here because usually that's where I say, I can help you with sharing my experience, but I won't do it for you. And here is an example of what it gives. That's a very straightforward example with a very little observation error, very little noise. There is just one record that was below the ground. So that's kind of an exceptional time period for some reason. And you still see that even with little noise, it's still already difficult to detect the period when the bird was in a thermal and the period when the bird was gliding. So imagine with more noise, and the typical range of the observation error was estimated to be 50 to 100 meters. So it's pretty noisy data. Anyway, once the data is hopefully cleaned in a good enough way, the perhaps more interesting part of the work was a model of flight height based on the aerodynamics and the behavior of the bird. So the first part is it's the same model that's often used to parameterize the unmanned gliding aircrafts, and it's based on the so the assumption that the bird is minimizing time, so moving as fast as it can in order to spend more time eating food or caring for its chicks. And the other time, and no constraint on thermal availability, which the results match the data. So it kind of mean that the birds are as efficient enough to find thermal, that the thermal are not restricting. My English is terrible. I've been in France for 5 years, and so. So anyway, the parameters of that model are the central parameter is the speed, the power of the uplift, which is named W for the. I will use that again later. And then the other parameters are H star and VX star, which are the basic parameters of an aerodynamic model for soaring flights. And this model has been worked out for 50 years or more. And the detail for the formula are given in the 3 paper here, for example. And the basic conclusion is that we can estimate the proportion of the time that is spent in the danger zone, which is the zone that the turbines would sweep if there was a turbine. And then the other aspect is that for birds, they have a choice of other flight modes. And for that, I just incorporated a resource selection function, meaning that if the W, the uplift strength is low, the bird will choose another flight mode than thermal uplift. And if the uplift potential is high, they will favor thermal uplift. And the result is a prediction of collision risk as a function of thermal uplift speed W. And the good thing, well, the reason why I did that is that the potential W, that's a type of weather data that we can obtain from either weather databases online retrospectively. So even years ago, we have this data to put together with the telemetry data. And we can also forecast W for other part of the world or time period in the future. For the rest of the data, the polar parameters they are measured on the birds upon capture when people feed them with GPS. For example, they measure the wing shape and so on. And the rest, that was what I did, is to estimate the rest of the parameters from the GPS tract after error correction using a standard binomial model. And I did that for 3 species that people were gracious enough to provide data for. So the interesting point was that those 3 species have very contrasted life histories and physical attributes. So we have the heaviest soaring birds in the world. Well, the condor. Well, maybe they are soaring bird. They're the whatever. And then there is the griffon vulture, which is a bit more typical in terms of wing loading. And then the golden eagle, which is like more of a facultative soaring bird. They use soaring flight mostly for long distance movement and because they are more of a predatory bird and less of a scavenger bird. And so a bit of raw results. The main point of this figure is to show that there is a response to thermal uplift potential, so that weather data variable does match with the observed flight height and vertical velocity. So there's a response here. So that was a pretty good point. That mostly for illustrative purposes. We can extrapolate the home range based on this data. So that large pancake is the home range in 3D. So that was not a given. And the main result of the study, also as pertaining to the topic of the seminar today, is collision risk predictions. So we see that the first conclusion is that there are quite substantial differences between the 3 species. And they were really as expected from the life history, behavior, and physical attributes of the birds. For example, Andean condors, they are so heavy on the wings that they rely on thermal uplift, even when the thermal uplift is not very strong. and therefore their climbing rate is slow, and they exit the thermals at low altitudes, and therefore they spend a lot of time in the danger zone. And for griffon vultures, on the contrary, they tend to favor orographic uplift whenever they find it, and they use thermal uplift only when it's very strong. And therefore, we see that they mostly, when the thermal uplift is strong, they mostly fly above the turbine. So that's a factor of risk that they do not have compared to the Andean condor. And when the golden eagles, as expected, they are kind of a facultative soaring birds, and so they don't really rely on thermal uplift in routine, I would say. And so there was the response to thermal uplift potential was not very strong in terms of collision risk. And that's about it. So in terms of perspectives, this study had, in my opinion, applied potential in terms of selecting the areas with the lowest predicted risk when you want to set up a new turbine. Also schedule the maintenance shutdowns to make them correspond with the period of high predicted risk in order to shut the turbines when the risk is highest, if you have to shut them down. And also what would ideally need to be done once the data become publicly available is to adapt that model for post-construction behavior. So increasingly, as more and more data emerge, we see that the birds do not behave the same when there is a turbine, and that's a good thing, hopefully. And we could potentially incorporate this information into the model. And in terms of modeling, this had us thinking about the issue of art barriers and environmental interaction into continuous time models. Because when you talk about vertical movement, there's the ground, that's an impossible barrier. And in terms of models, there were a series of issues, and I tried to like summarize the state of the thinking. It's not user ready yet, but I wrote a paper recently on that. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Guillaume, for your presentation. Next speaker, Ana Teresa Marquez, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ro. Well, I cannot share my screen yet. I think Guillaume has to stop sharing him.
Guillaume, could you stop sharing your screen, and then maybe Anna will be able to. There you go. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think you're already seeing it.
Yes, we can see it. Fine.
Yes. Okay, so hello all, good afternoon or good morning to all. And thank you for the invitation for being here. I'll present, what I'm going to present today is a part of my PhD, and it resulted from a collaboration from several research and institutions from Europe, from Portugal, Germany, Spain, and also Norway. And it has been published in Journal of Animal Ecology if somebody wants to take a look. And why study bird migration and wind farms, and why study the soaring birds and during migration? So as already talked a little bit today, soaring birds are dependent on the uplift potential and the uplift conditions for traveling, mainly when they travel long distances. So during migration, they tend to gather in specific locations, mainly when they want they need to cross large water bodies like seas, for example. And these areas are also being targeted for large wind projects worldwide. And there are already several programs and projects that have mitigations targeting collision and mortality risk, mainly with actions with shutdown on demand. But there are still few data and few knowledge about if these structures have some kind of result on some kind of displacement for these birds during migration. So here in this study, we aimed to identify and quantify the displacement effects caused by wind turbines on migratory soaring birds. And we specifically test if the area near the wind turbines are less used than the surroundings, and if this could be related with the uplift conditions of the locations. And also we tried to quantify the losses of the area available for these birds during migration. So we use the black kite as our model species. This is a quite common bird in Europe and is a medium size species and is an obligatory soarer species. So it was a good model for us. And we studied this species during the migratory period in the southern Spain, in Tarifa. And in this area, there is a big number of wind farms already constructed. And these dots here, you can see they are all wind turbines. There are over 1,000 wind turbines in this area. And this is also a bottleneck for soaring birds that travel from Europe, from Western Europe to Africa. And thousands of birds pass and cross this location every year. Most of them are black kites. And our study focused on the southern part of this region, where we have 7 wind farms and 160 turbines. So we studied the migration during 2012 and 13. During the post-breeding migration, we used data from birds that were tracked with the GPS GSM devices. These birds were captured during the Levanter winds, which are winds blowing from the east that block the passage of the migration. So the birds stay in Spain for some days and up to a week until the wind changes. And we captured these birds on trapped bait with carrion and fitted the birds with GPS GSM loggers that give us locations at least once per minute. And we had a quite big number of birds, 130 birds from both sex and adults and also juveniles. So this is the data, the raw data we got. We tracked, each bird was tracked for an average of 3 days. We had a big numbers of GPS and we modeled the space use of these birds with the Brownian bridges models. And we implemented an impact gradient design, which means that we studied the distance and saw how the space use of these birds changed through the distance of wind turbines. We also used as predictors the availability of thermal and orographic uplifts. I'm not going to talk much about this, as we already saw some presentations about this topic, but just to let you know that we used a tool developed by the Intact project from NINA that used models that was based on models already presented by other authors, and a previous study tested if these models were good for our area and for our model species, and it was published in scientific reports by Carlos Santos, and you can also take a look for further details about these models in the publication from last year from Frank Hansen. So our results, here in the left you see the space use in this region, and in the right some details, some bird tracks, and we can see that birds almost always they have their flights are not that much closer to the wind turbines. And our models confirm that, oh, sorry, before that, just to give you a short look of the results for the thermal and orographic estimates for this region. In the left, we can see that we have higher values for the orographic uplift, but such uplift is relatively scattered in the area. Whether the thermal uplift is more constant and present but we have some regions with higher values. And our modeling shows that we have the birds use, space use, it's higher in areas with higher uplift conditions, as we were expecting. And we also found that the distance to the turbines affect the way the birds use the space. And we found an effect from the wind turbines up to 700 meters from the turbines. So we also tested if this result could be related to the fact that there was no updrafts near the turbines, and we saw, and our models showed us that the areas that are close to the turbines are less used than it's really potential. So there are updrafts in these locations, or that at least they have conditions to have. Later on, we also tried to quantify the area that it has good conditions for soaring in this area, and we see that the different wind farms locations are located in different areas with different uplift conditions, which is an interesting result. It gives us hope about and reflects the importance of micro-seating and selecting the locations for wind turbines. And our models showed us that about 40% or up to 30% of the area with good conditions for soaring was within the influence of the wind turbines. So to wrap it up, in this area, and this species was affected in their corridors and their areas that have potential for being used during migration, and there was a loss of up to 40%. And we highlight that the habitat loss caused by these structures, by wind turbines, should be further studied, because we still don't know much about the effect and how much this can affect these birds, and if there are cumulative impacts. And also, and as we already heard today, that updrafts should be taken into account when planning new projects. And this is true mainly for locations that are important for soaring birds and also for migratory soaring birds. And I just leave some questions maybe for later, and it's why these wind farms cause functional habitat loss for the species. Is it they are somehow strange structures that cause some neophobia to the birds? Do they have they learned that these can be a harmful structures? Do the wind turbines disturb the airflow, and this could be the reason why the birds are being displaced by these locations? So that's it. I just want to acknowledge all the people and institutions that provided logistical support to this work. And that's it.
Thank you, Teresa. I would now invite Sergio to the floor.
Yeah. So
Please.
I'll try to share my screen just a moment. And just a second, sorry. And cannot see the screen.
Not yet.
Right. Wait. Come on. It disappears all the time that I click on the task bar. I don't know why. And maybe I ask the presentation mode. And so let's see if it does work. I don't see the share button on the. I'm sorry.
Do you see a green share screen button at the bottom?
No, it's that when I open the presentation, disappear Zoom. So I'll try again. So now I cannot see Zoom at all. Here, now I have. It's really small icon now, and let's see, share screen. Here, share, and I think you see my PowerPoint now.
Yes.
And now do you see my presenter mode, I guess?
Yeah, and then just display settings.
Like that?
Perfect.
Okay. Fine. So thank you for the invitation. For me, it is a pleasure to present my work here during this webinar. And today I will present something on my work on bearded vultures and potential conflicts with wind energy development within Switzerland. And why the bearded vultures? Well, the bearded vultures was extirpated from the European Alps at the early 20th century. And the main causes were strong reduction of wild ungulate, and even, as you can see from the illustration here on the slide, from a systematic direct persecution. And not only from the European Alps, and you can probably see here that most of the original distributional areas, the species is extincted. So not anymore on the Balkans or Italy, and also in North Africa and Morocco is really only restricted to the Atlas Mountains. And in Spain as well, the only population remain on the Pyrenees. And for that, in 1986, a large-scale reintroduction project started, and they start to release birds first in France, followed by Austria, Italy, and Switzerland, and even there are new projects of releasing projects in Spain, in Andalusia, and Pico d'Europa. And thanks to this large-scale reintroduction project, the population is now steadily and slowly growing and spreading all around the Swiss of the European alpine range. And at the moment, there are not documented fatalities, but the presence of wind turbines is really marginal inside the British Vulture distribution area. But on the other hand, there are evidence that wind turbines are often erected on areas with landforms and wind conditions similar to those that are selected from many bird raptor species, and also that it has a high impact on other large soaring raptors like the griffon vulture. And for that, there is the need of predicting this risk and providing planning tools, special planning tools to energy companies and wildlife managers. Like all the other countries in the world, even in Switzerland, there is a plan for increasing the production toward using wind energy. And this map here shows potential areas designated to produce wind energy. And part of these are within the alpine range that is here in gray in this map. And in red, you can see the wind turbines that are already in operation. There are not so many at the moment in Switzerland, but you can see from this other slide, in blue, there are many wind turbines that are already planned within the alpine range. And for those that are not familiar with Switzerland, this part here is the Jura mountain and the high plateau. That's outside of the areas of the bearded vultures, and so most of the wind plants are in this area, but many of them fall inside the alpine range. Some years ago, the the Swiss Ornithological Station provided this conflict map, and they had a general framework of using buffer areas around sensitive locations. And for the bearded vultures, there were the nesting site and the releasing site. But this approach here has some problems because it is based on the knowledge that at a specific point in the time, in this case it's 2013, but after 2013 we have a new releasing site on the Central Alps, and also there are many new nesting sites all around the Swiss Alpine range. So this kind of approach cannot predict any future conflicts. And moreover, we have that we don't know how the species uses the habitat within these buffers. And also might be that some of parts inside these buffer areas are not used by the species because it's not suitable for the species, or also that the species flies far above the ground, and so at a height that is not dangerous for the species. For that, we decided to have another approach to the problem, and we use predictive models to model the probability of presence of the species. And we even wanted to know the ability of our models to predict future circumstances. So for that, we use casual observations collected in different databases like Ornitho, or there is a specific database for the bearded vultures. It's called International Bearded Vultures Monitoring. And we use data collected from 2004 to 2014, and then we evaluated our model on data collected after 2014. And also we use some GPS data as well collected after 2014, and we evaluated our model on this data collected after on a time after the one that we used to train the model. We were also interested on differences in ecological requirements between two age classes and seasons. And you can see from the 4 maps in this slide that the species uses the habitat in a different way according to the season and according to the to the age class. The map here on the left is a kind of overall map that summarizes the previous 4 models. So that shows the probability of presence of the species regardless the age. And we also provide this presence absence, or we call it more potential risk map on the right. Basically, it has a value ranging from 1 to 4, and an area with a value of 1 is where only one of the previous models predicted as available for the species, and with 4 where all the 4 models agree and have and predict as a suitable for the species. So this is a kind of broad overview of where the conflict might occur between wind energy development and the species. What is important to notice is also that all the nesting sites were correctly predicted. So even the one that appeared after 2014, they all fall within the predicted areas. And also it's important to note that many of the pairs change their territory over time. So basically we had more than 12 nesting locations after 2014, and all but one, they are all within the area predicted as suitable from the model. And this nest site that is outside is only 60 meters outside of the nearest predicted area. And these maps, they show the probability of presence of the species, but they don't say anything about the flight behavior or how the species uses the space. So in a second step, we were interested on modeling the flight heights. And for that, we use GPS locations. During the releasing project, many of these birds have been tagged with GPS loggers. And from 2005, there are more than 10 millions of GPS locations collected by more than 100 birds. I focus here the analysis on the data collected within Switzerland and from birds that were flying. And we ended up with around 3 millions of GPS fixes. And also they are coming from different GPS devices, so the schedule of these devices is different among birds. And we subsample the data in order to have a maximum of 1 location per minute. So we ended up with around 230,000 GPS locations collected by 30 different birds. And we used some environmental variables like land cover, food availability, and terrain characteristic and wind speed to model the probability of flying below 200 meters. And here I show you the output of this model. And it looks like most of the alpine range, the probability of flying below 200 meters is high. And this reflects also the data, because more than 70% of the GPS locations are collected below 200 meters, meaning that the species flies mainly below 200 meters. And this map, of course, shows the probability of flying below 200 meters, but doesn't say anything about the habitat suitability. So in a first step, we combined the output of these 2 different models, the one modeling the probability of flying below 200 meters and the habitat suitability. And we obtained that map that basically shows the probability of flying in a dangerous height within the habitat of the species. So those are really areas where we should focus the attention, because they are the area where the conflict might occur with with higher probability. So to conclude it, we started with the potential distribution of the species to identify the broad areas where the conflict with wind energy might occur. And then we refined this map using the flight height analysis to identify the high-risk conflict areas. And as a final remark, I would like to say that the maps that I show you are only for general guidance, and they cannot in any case replace the required environmental impact assessment. That means from a wind energy perspective, it can allow a company to make a plan on an early stage, meaning that areas that are highlighted as a high probability of conflict can be excluded a priori because an environmental impact assessment would probably deny the new project. And while areas that are predicted with low probability of conflict, the environmental impact assessment will probably not deny the new project. So I just would like to thank my supervisor, Veronica Brownish and Rafael Arleta, and all the private foundations that sponsored my project, together with the partner of the releasing project that provided the data, and of course you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sergio, and thank you to all speakers. We have now had the pleasure to hear all speakers now. So the coming time until 6 o'clock, we have now time for a short joint discussion and question and answer session. So I would like to invite all speakers to turn on their camera so they can all join on stage. I will now try to kind of find some of questions. We don't have time to answer all questions, but at least trying to find some common themes for all the different authors to answer and to touch upon. But all questions and their answers will also be posted on the website afterwards. First question maybe to Jeff and Esteban. Whether visual or auditory, do you assume that the ability to detect translates into avoidance behavior?
The short answer is maybe. It seems to us that the most important thing is to ensure that the eagles are alerted to the presence of the turbine. Whether it's avoidance or simply alerting is a separate issue. But the best thing that we can do is to present some alerting stimuli that are easily detected in a wide variety of environments or sort of conditions, and the expectation would be that that itself would help keep them out of the turbines.
So to add to that, our project was mainly related to characterizing the sensory worlds of these two species. As you all know, these species are of conservation concern. So the possibility of take was zero. So we had to work with rehab centers to be able to get access to these animals. Which was extremely challenging, right? And that also had a relationship with a question in the forum about sample sizes, right? We also incorporated this sort of preliminary behavior component, but the basic idea here is that we now have based on these two projects, we have a better understanding of what kinds of stimuli we can start looking into. Stimuli that we know are going to stimulate the retina or the ear quite a bit. The next phase is, okay, we know that of these stimuli, which ones generate the type of behavioral response that we want. And that could be an alert response. It could be a freaking out response and leaving the area. So we haven't got a project that has addressed that yet, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. And maybe to follow up on that a bit from my side, is that now we've had some talks about the kind of auditory and visual cues that birds may use, and also heard about kind of actually how they're flying in the landscape with regard to updraft, with regard to the wakes and a kind of complex three-dimensional world. So what would be more important to address when, if you want to go for kind of looking at kind of how can we best reduce risk? Is that to warn them using either auditory or visual cues, or is that to provide them with a safe flying environment? Maybe this is more an open question to both kind of our physiologists here, but also kind of, for example, Elliot or any of the others that feel they have something to contribute.
I think there are different combinations of things that could be done, and I don't think we should limit ourselves, particularly at this early stage, to just one path, right? From my point of view, I think using a combination of both visual and sound, it's a really important way to start exploring that in that realm. One of the things that we were told most of the time is that eagles, when they get close to the wind turbines, sometimes they move their head down trying to locate some prey. And so what we're showing is that's not a good thing from at least a visual point of view, right? So if we can do something in those instances in which the animal is very close to the blades, to bring back the attention to where the animal is, I think that might be a really good idea.
Yeah, just to add on, I think a comprehensive approach is definitely preferred at this point. We should use whatever means that we have at our disposal to help create a safer environment, especially because different species react differently to different types of stimuli and warning signals. And also, I think it's important to better characterize the flow environment around the wind farm, so we could potentially perhaps design safe corridors for different species to transit the wind farm. But I think this is a pretty challenging endeavor, especially because the optimal location and placements of these wind turbines is directly at odds with where the animals want to be, just because that's where the best wind resource is. So really, if there's an alternative that's more passive that we can deploy, that doesn't involve either changing the layout or curtailment, because changing cut-in speed, for example, that translates into significant revenue loss from a developer perspective. So really, yeah, if we can come up with a better curtailment strategy that's passive and applicable to a variety of species, that would be ideal. So yeah, we should use everything at our disposal.
I very much agree with that. They're not alternatives. They're complementary approaches that we can take, and frankly, the more directions or really dimensions that we can bring to the fore to help keep any of these animals out of the wind turbines, the better. Thank you.
So now we're kind of looking at the various aspects which may play a role, but what I'm also wondering about, and also a question that came in, how do golden eagles find the thermals? Is it visual, is it auditory, is it any other kind of measure? So maybe someone from our talks touching upon thermals can answer those questions, can answer the question. Guillaume or Anna Teresa? Elliot?
I can say that actually we don't know. I think it's an extra sensory sense that they have. And people with a physiological experience can work on that. I can't answer.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging question, especially when there's a combination of orographic plus thermal updrafts. We have seen some data where, depending on the species, they'll follow orographic updrafts, but if they feel a thermal updraft, they'll deviate from what would be the optimal orographic updraft region. So I think it's a challenging problem that's very dependent on the local microclimate and species.
Yeah, just to add up, I'll say that during migration, probably the birds will follow the other birds that are already on the thermals, but that's just a very specific cue to follow.
Yeah. So I mean, what is also kind of clear is that birds are, when they're flying through the area, that on the one hand they may be attracted to the turbines, or at least the landscape in which the turbines are placed because of thermals. On the other hand, they may be displaced by this. So how bad is actually displacement when it saves raptors from collision? Should we worry at all about this? Any thoughts on that, Anna?
Well, I would say that it's better to be displaced than killed, but I don't think it's that simplistic anyway. So collision, it's a real issue, and we already know a lot about it, but we are still starting to learn about displacement. And I would say that in areas where they're being planned with thousands and thousands of wind turbines, and in areas that are critical for soaring birds, I think that might be a problem. And operations that shut down the turbines during migratory periods, we don't know if it's enough for them.
Yes, thank you. Now maybe kind of continue for a question to Sergio. What do you think would be more important with regard to risk to raptors? Would that be large-scale habitat suitability and kind of siting kind of wind turbines at the right or at the wrong location, or fine-scale flight behavior of the raptors?
Well, I believe both. Like, one gives you a broad overview of where conflicts might appear, and the other, of course, for micro-siting, where you want to place a wind turbine in a place where a species is occurring, you might try to find a compromise where probability of collisions are lower. So I would say both.
Thank you. Yeah. Still a couple of minutes left. Maybe taking it a bit broader, going from your talks to more general topics. How much do physiology and behavior actually matter? Is it just, bad luck or being at the wrong place at the wrong time, or is there something more behind there? And to maybe make a bit more specific, this general question, kind of how can we reduce uncertainty related to the drivers of risk to raptors? Do we know what we don't know, and how can we kind of actually utilize all the knowledge that is coming from various fields in practice? Does anyone have some thoughts on that?
I think that we are better than we were a few years ago. So new information is coming out, and today's sessions is a wonderful example. But I think one of the gaps that I see is that there is not so much integration. So I think the people that presented today should have another session in which we talk about, okay, how can we integrate all these sources of information, right? And what should be the next question based on the integration of the physiology and behavioral information and the gaps. So I think that's something that the whole field could benefit from enormously.
Anyone else that wants to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the behavioral aspects are really important, and there are a lot of unknowns. So in developing our model at NREL, we're building in different types of behavior and responses to the environment sort of incrementally. So I think after we build up our model, what's left out, sort of the more anomalous behaviors are really going to be, I feel like, the drivers of higher risk. So I feel like we can predict what the eagle might do most of the time, but it's really in those off conditions where there's a sudden gust, or there's some food, there's prey it sees, then all of a sudden it might do something sporadic and unpredictable. And I think understanding that is pretty important.
I actually quite agree with that, because I mean, if you think about it, these are really long-lived animals, and it only takes a single event to take their life out, right? There's another thing that, if I can add on to what Esteban was saying, that you know, what physiology can do is to give us a little bit more insight into what's going on right at the time that the eagle is nearing the turbine. And it was quite shocking, actually, that the blind area above the head was as large as it was. And you know, a priori, we wouldn't have thought about that, and probably nobody else would have. And so what that does is to give us a little bit more insight into how to ask, you know, people who are actually looking at behavior. Well, so what's going on at the level of the turbine? Someone else, Anna, asked, you know, can they hear the turbines? Well, they probably can, but the problem is that the lower the frequency, the harder it is to localize a sound. So you know, there are all of these events together, you know, that Esteban was talking about, that, you know, it's not just physiology, and it's not just behavior, and it's not just wind patterns. It's all of that together that I think we have to integrate in order to solve these really important problems.
Thank you. Maybe one last question before we round off. This is more about, we've now heard various studies using a variety of different methodologies to kind of glean more knowledge on various aspects of risk, and also can be used for risk assessment and kind of operationalizing it through different measures. But what are the challenges of the general adoption of a methodology for risk assessment? Well, assuming that it's not flawed and it does help, what obstacles are there still that are still there before we can actually use it, or actually kind of the practitioners can use it? Maybe a short round and hear some thoughts from all the different presenters.
Well, I can start. I would say that at the moment, one of the main difficulties, like data sets are getting larger and larger, so we should be able to analyze very large data sets, and classical statistics methods are not useful for that. They are very slow and they take quite long, and when you realize that you did something wrong, it's maybe you lost already 1 week of your time. So for me, that's one of the challenges coming in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with what Sergio said. I think getting more validation data is always great, but then we have tens of millions of GPS data points, and we can put a data scientist on it, but then they won't understand the biology, and then you can put a biologist on it, but then they won't necessarily understand how to best process all that data. So I think it's a great multidisciplinary problem. But yeah, I think more data is always great.
I didn't say that it's a problem to have more data. I say that maybe we have to adapt and analyze big data sets.
Anna, do you have some thoughts?
So I sort of along these lines, the scope of the problem is massive, and it's not just the amount of data, it's the dimensionality of the problem, right? And you know, having the resources, and not only monetary but also personnel, to really attack the entire problem. It is a huge problem, and you know, and it will take really quite extraordinary efforts to put all of this stuff together.
Yes. Is there anyone else that has any thoughts they want to share?
Yeah, just very briefly, the question of consensus is the key here, because we have talked about integration across disciplines, but within disciplines, people are kind of struggling, as the way of science is that people oppose or like they are in competition. And when you make that visible to the general public, it gives way for folks to pull, and when it's very controversial, like it is in the wind energy sector, it can really weaken the scientific voice. We've seen that in a lot of public debates, even recently. I don't know. I've not been very clear because it is the end of the day and it's English, but I think it's an important point that we should strive to reach a consensus before going public, if it is ever possible. Anyway.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I will would like to kind of close off here. I would thank all speakers for their using the time, and everyone in the audience for listening and taking the time to come to this webinar and also kind of share their questions with us. So thank you very much. For now, the recording and presentations from the webinar will be hosted on Tethys, so you can find it on the link which is on the screen. And with that, I would like to finalize this webinar and thank you again for all your time, and hope to see you soon, also live sometime. Fly safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Adios.
Bye.